Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And my guest today, I'm pleased to tell you, is Vijaya Ramachandran. She is the Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute. Vijaya, many thanks for coming on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Robert. Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy 2022 to you. I didn't warn you, but if you've listened to my podcast, guests introduce themselves. So I know you have a long CV. I've looked at it. I'm not going to repeat it. But imagine you've arrived somewhere and you have less than a minute to introduce yourself. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Robert. I am the Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute, which is in Berkeley, California. And I work on issues related to energy access in poor countries. I have a long history of working in sub-Saharan Africa, including interviewing businesses in Africa to understand what their constraints are. And I've always been told that energy is a huge constraint. So it's always been a central focus of my work.
Well, that's a good summary. Well, and that leads right to one of the first things. I mean, we met a few months ago, and in fact, in Sausalito at the Breakthrough Dialogue, and I was fascinated by your presentation. But I wanted to start by talking about this piece that you wrote in Foreign Policy that was published in November. It was titled, "Rich Countries' Climate Policies Are Colonialism in Green." You said, at COP26, 20 countries went even further, pledging to stop all funding for overseas fossil fuel projects beginning next year. It was clear you talked about development and energy. Why does this irritate you so much? Why is this, as my father would used to say, why does this get your goat?
So I think that to me, this is sort of rank hypocrisy. Basically, the rich countries are using as much fossil fuels as they want. And in the weeks and months since COP26, every rich country has increased its use of fossil fuels to meet its heating needs for the winter, to meet the gaps in renewable energy. The wind has stopped blowing in Europe for the last several months, so coal consumption is up in Europe. Every country in Europe is trying to increase its imports of natural gas to meet its energy needs. There is a strong recognition amongst rich countries that they need to meet their citizens' demands for energy. That if there are shortages, whether it be in Europe or whether it be in the US, we are going to call for more energy from all kinds of sources. So in the US, for example, President Biden has asked oil and gas producers to step up production, to meet rising prices here. I think a couple of weeks after COP, the US government auctioned the rights to 1.1 billion barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. We have called upon OPEC to increase production. So there is, one set of rules for the rich countries. They can use whatever energy sources they need to meet demands. But at the same time, they're imposing another set of rules on poor countries, telling them that they are refusing to allow the financing of any kind of fossil fuel production in sub-Saharan Africa, in countries that are dependent on international financing. And that really was the main outcome of COP26. There wasn't a whole lot more that happened other than that pledge. There were some net zero commitments for, 2040 and 2050 and 2070. And, who knows whether those will be realized. I think it's relatively easy from a political perspective.
They won't.
to make commitments.
They're far enough in the future that it's certain that they won't happen, but nevertheless. Go.
Right. I mean, it's out there in the future. The people who are making these commitments will likely not be in power, at that time. But for poor countries, the command is to stop producing fossil fuels now. So, the pledge to not finance fossil fuels goes into effect immediately. And at the World Bank, the rich countries, which are the majority shareholders, are forcing the World Bank and other multilateral development banks to, quote, align with the Paris Agreement and not do any financing of fossil fuels past 2025, which is, very soon.
Sure.
I find this double standard, doing whatever we like in our own countries and then imposing these bans on poor countries, the poorest countries, which are also the lowest emitting countries. I find that a form of green colonialism, and that's why I'm calling out these countries. I think it's hypocritical and it's colonial in attitude to say, we'll tell you what's best for you while we do whatever we like.
Well, I wanted to follow on that because, I mean, no disrespect to you, but other people have made this same kind of observation, and there have been several different. In fact, it was in 2015. I looked it up because I wrote a piece about it for National Review back then. That Arvind Subramanian, who was then India's director or advisor on chief economic advisor, wrote a piece that was in the Financial Times, I think, if memory serves, and he said that these efforts to stop, he was talking about what was happening in Paris now, so this is 7 years ago, now we're in 2022. He said that these efforts to stop fossil fuel projects in poor countries, quote, smacks of carbon imperialism. And such imperialism on the part of advanced nations could spell disaster for India and other developing countries. So now you've said climate colonialism, energy colonialism, carbon imperialism. This is all the same, though, isn't it? I mean, is there one phrase that, I mean, I guess all of them apply, but
all of them apply,
but it's all pernicious and of the same cloth. No,
agree. Arvind has been, as you mentioned, speaking and writing about this for a long time, and he has a piece a couple of days ago in Project Syndicate where he again.
Oh right, yes, I saw that headline. I meant to look at that. I saw the headline but didn't read the piece.
Yeah, he again raises these concerns, and he says that this sort of repackaging of development finance into climate finance could lead to also sort of a set of financial pathologies as donors, flood countries with climate financing, which is the sort of the latest fad. But you are right; these are different ways of expressing the problem. There's also an op-ed in the Financial Times by Uzodinma Ibiala, a Nigerian scholar, who argues that this type of refusing to finance certain types of energy projects in poor countries is a form of climate redlining. Similar to how banks in the United States refuse to, lend to African Americans or other ethnic groups. And so he makes that parallel. There are a number of us, Todd Moss at the Energy for Growth Hub has also been writing about this. There's a number of us kind of sounding the alarm using slightly different phrases. My fear, Robert, is that this is sort of overwhelmed by, our voices are overwhelmed by the rich countries' priorities, which seem to cater much more to their own domestic environmental constituencies and their own domestic priorities than what Africans need or what poor countries need or what the World Bank should do from a development perspective. I think the overwhelming sense in the rich world is that we've consumed all this carbon. We've got all this pollution and all these carbon emissions, and we've got this terrible problem of climate change. And domestically, we are not able to do a whole lot other than technological advances. So we are not able to ban fracking. We're not able to ban leasing of oil and gas production on public lands. We're not able to curb meat consumption. We're not able to impose a carbon tax or raise prices or anything like that. So then the politically easy thing to do is to impose these bans on other countries and make it sound like victory. So, amongst the rich countries that signed this pledge at COP26 to stop financing fossils in poor countries, there was an enormous amount of self-congratulation going on between the various envoys, all congratulating each other. I didn't see many African envoys or any African envoys congratulating them for this pledge. And when the media covered this story, the quotes were almost always from Western-based environmental NGOs endorsing this pledge, not from Africans. Not from people who have barely any electricity all day long or are not able to grow food because they don't have enough fertilizer. We are not hearing those voices. We are hearing the voices of the rich world or people in the rich world who are, whose consumption needs are met. And for them, the sense is, we need to cut back this stuff. So, as Todd and I were writing in foreign policy, there's this fear that Black and brown people will destroy our climate ambitions. So, let's stop that before that happens. Let's stop them from doing that. That seems to be the prevailing view.
But I think you're right. I think you hit on something that I hadn't really thought about that in the way that you phrased it, though, that Yes, it would be. It's a first way. It's a first class ticket out of office to say, oh yes, you, my constituents here, you're not going to eat hamburgers, and we're not going to give you gasoline, and this is the way to this is the way to lose your position. But it's easy to say, oh well, we'll do it over there, somewhere else, so that none of this climate policy is going to affect you. We'll do it in a way that doesn't affect you, but will claim victory. I think it's a really key insight. Well, okay, so name names here for me. Look,
Yeah.
you've been at this a long time. You've been at World Bank. You were at you worked at the UN. You've been at the Center for Global Development. Now you're at Breakthrough. You've watched this a long time. So who are the NGOs who are pushing this kind of policy? Name them.
I would say a very large coalition of NGOs across the rich world. In the US, the big ones, Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, various other large NGOs. Also, some of the development NGOs have signed on to this, which I think is unfortunate, and I've tried to call them out on this a bit. In Europe, I think a very, very, very large coalition of NGOs and others in the sort of green movement that really want energy to be wind and solar only.
And so this would be friends in Europe would be Friends of the Earth then?
Yes, I think things like that, that have both US presence and Europe presence. Many of these NGOs are sort of across the Western world.
Right.
And I think that's one constituency. I wouldn't say that's the only constituency. I think also there are constituencies, comprised of sort of so-called green parties that have convinced their constituents that, there is a world of wind and solar only. There is a world where all energy must come from wind and solar only. And so I think,
let's see if I can I interrupt there, because I think that's a key issue here, because I'm assuming you have Indian heritage,
Yes.
and I've only been to India once, so I'm no expert, but it's a very large country with an enormous population. And we traveled in the countryside and I didn't see any empty area. I mean, for being such a big country, it's populated throughout pretty much everywhere in the country. And so this idea that, there's a lot of land, this is the bias, and the one that it just grills my cheese, to quote my late brother, John Bryce, that, we'll just build all this wind and solar. Well, where exactly are you going to put it? And where exactly are you going to impose? I mean, forget the carbon part of it, but this idea, we're just going to use wind and solar. Well, the land, I'll ask the question instead of giving you the homily here. Is there enough land in India to make renewables work at scale?
Yeah, it's a very, very tough question, Robert. India has made this commitment to increase its solar capacity from the current 44 gigawatts to 5,700 gigawatts.
Oh, no, I didn't know that. 44 gigawatts today to 5,700?
44 gigawatts today to 5,700 gigawatts by, I think, 2070 is the target. And as you say, land issues are paramount. They're paramount here too. Land issues are really significant, both for solar and for wind. And in the rich world, we're seeing this pushback on wind. People don't like looking at wind turbines. They don't want their land being used for wind turbines. And I was reading a piece in Politico this morning that said that in Germany, there's one or two states that have passed rules that make it virtually impossible to install wind turbines.
Right.
And
Bavaria is one of them. Yeah.
Bavaria. That's right. They mentioned Bavaria. So I think, we'll start to see some kinds of backlash like that. I think some of these targets are really ambitious and very, very hard to realize. And I think it is also the case that from a purely technological perspective, we are not in a world where we are wind and solar only. No country is. And so to try to impose that on poor countries, I think is immoral and unjust. There are several sectors in which you cannot build things with renewable energy only. And, in my various writings at Breakthrough, I pointed out the production of cement and steel, which is critical for poor countries building infrastructure, needs fossil fuels, and in particular, it needs natural gas. The production of fertilizer is done most efficiently using natural gas, and Africa's fertilizer use is a tenth of India's use, and its yields are about a tenth of India's yields. So there's enormous room for improvement there, but they will need access to cheaply produced fertilizer, and that in turn requires natural gas. And then for transportation,
may I interrupt there, because I really
sure.
I want to explore this, because I've written just a little bit. I just touched about on it a little bit, but the closure of fertilizer plants that we've seen across Europe because of high natural gas prices. We've seen fertilizer plants closing in Asia as well. Shortages of urea. That this is the one. Okay, so there are a lot of issues around this renewable only vision, but the one that I think has not gotten nearly enough attention is the reality that the Haber-Bosch process and turning gas into ammonia, nitrogen-rich ammonia for fertilizer, this is key to the food economy. And so this idea that we're going to do without hydrocarbons ignores the fact that, as Alex Epstein puts it very well, that hydrocarbons are the food of food. So how might this play out then in poorer countries if there isn't enough fertilizer? Could we see food shortages or just drastically higher food prices? Have you thought about this much?
So we see all of that already. We see food shortages in Africa every year, and many African cities are forced to import very costly food. And you also have a high degree of malnutrition and undernourishment because food is so expensive and so hard to produce. The Moroccan government has invested a substantial amount of money in producing fertilizer. And Morocco's parastatal has started to push into African markets and sell fertilizer to different countries. Many African countries are in desperate need of more fertilizer, better produced, cheaper produced fertilizer. And there is demand for it. And there are sources of production. What we don't need is for the Western countries to impose natural gas bans. Because as you mentioned, that's a critical input into the production of fertilizer, the Haber-Bosch process. And that's where I'm trying to kind of push back against the donors. This is not a conversation about Africa wanting to produce more coal. It does not want to produce more coal, but it does want to exploit its natural gas reserves for food production, for the production of industrial inputs, for liquefied natural gas for transportation. And if donors decide they don't want to finance natural gas projects and try to prevent everybody from financing natural gas projects, that's basically keeping Africans poor so that we can claim some sort of victory to our domestic constituencies. It makes no sense from any argument, and it particularly doesn't make sense because Africa contributes 4% of global emissions. So, banning them from fossil fuel production is sort of the most absurd way you can go about things, while increasing rich countries' own fossil fuel production. It's the exact opposite of what you would want if you were really serious about addressing climate change. You would want to reduce emissions in rich countries, and you would want to allocate any remaining carbon budget to the poorest countries that need these fossil fuels for food production, for industrial inputs. What we're seeing is the exact opposite, because I think the politics dictate that. The politics are such that we are in a great rush to please environmental constituencies, and this is the fastest, easiest path of least resistance. But I think it's sort of devastating for poor countries that are trying to become rich.
Well, and you use that word unjust and those words unjust and immoral, and I completely agree with you. But I think the other part of the backdrop that I see in Africa in particular is now in Tanzania, Senegal, Mauritania, these massive discoveries of new gas that could be developed. Now, is there going to be enough capital? Well, that's always a question, right? But if there's no foreign capital available, if BlackRock is saying, if World Bank is saying, the Biden administration is also saying the same thing, oh no, we're going to prevent the financing. Even if as I understand it, from some of these bilateral or multilateral lenders, they're going to say, oh, well, we'll lend to you for LNG import, but we're not going to lend to you for LNG export or exploitation. Have I heard this correctly?
There's there is some interest in financing imports because those imports come from rich countries, and the rich countries are the shareholders, and that's what I picked up on in the foreign policy piece that you mentioned at the start of our conversation. Norway has agreed to increase its natural gas exports by 2 billion cubic meters to alleviate Europe's energy shortage. Norway is very happy to increase its exports of natural gas to whoever will buy it at ever increasing prices. So it will make a lot of money from this current shortage that we are all experiencing. At the same time, Norway is pushing very hard inside the World Bank to prevent the financing of natural gas projects in sub-Saharan Africa. This is green colonialism. This is what I'm kind of trying to call out, that as far as their own interests are concerned, whether it be financial or whether it be satisfying their own consumers' energy needs, they're very happy to export natural gas and produce more natural gas. Norway is the most fossil fuel dependent rich country in the world. 14% of its GDP comes from natural gas,
wow.
oil and gas exports.
I didn't realize that.
And 6 to 7% of employment, 14% of government revenues from oil and gas. But at the same time, this country, wants to say in international fora, to look good, really, that poor countries should not be exploiting these very same resources that it has. And the argument that's made, Robert, is that Africans shouldn't make the mistakes we made. Well, Africans have expanded their production of renewables to a very significant extent. Several countries are majority renewable. They are not asking to produce coal. They're not asking to produce fossil fuels only. They're asking very reasonably to be able to exploit their natural gas reserves, of which they have an enormous amount of natural gas, to meet the kinds of production needs that cannot be met with renewables. That's what they're asking for. It's an extremely reasonable request. And I think what the rich countries are doing right now is just really very hypocritical, and they must be called out for what they're doing, I think.
Well, so let me step back a moment, because I'm very interested in your work in Africa and this issue and how you're phrasing and how you're framing the issues. But I was looking at your CV. You have 3 degrees from Harvard University, including a PhD. Were you born in India, raised in India, end up at Harvard? Tell me how that happened. I'm just curious.
Luck, I think. Yes, I was born and raised in India. I'm from Bangalore in South India.
Right.
And when I was in high school, my teachers encouraged me to apply to Harvard, so I did. And that's how I got in, and I got a scholarship to attend. And so that's when I moved to the US, and then I remained there for my advanced degrees as well. So that's how that came about.
Well, so I'm just curious because, Jennifer Hernandez, who's now on
Yes.
the board at Breakthrough Institute, and she's been on the podcast, and I greatly admire. It talks about green Jim Crow in California, right? We talked about green imperialism, green colonialism, but I'm just curious because she's talked about it. I mean, she wrote about that in her own essay about how you ended up in Cambridge, and now you're affiliated, you're living in California. I guess you're in San Diego. But I mean, that's quite a remarkable life path, no? I mean, do you ever think about that, or you talk to your friends and your family in Bangalore and think, well, wow, this is amazing. How did I end up here? Does that occur to you?
Yes, I think for those of us who migrated to different parts of the world, very far away from where we grew up, there is sort of a commonality of experience. You grow up in a very different setting, and then you end up career-wise and life-wise in a very different place. In some sense, the Bangalore I was raised in was a small town. It was sort of post-colonial. It still had a lot of British architecture. It had very little going on beyond sort of regular economic activity. And now, if you go to Bangalore, it's a bustling town. It's the hub of India's IT industry. It's a very global city. There's people from all over the world living and working there. There's very little of its colonial past anymore. It's got, big gleaming IT companies surrounding the core of the city, a big international airport. So India has changed a lot as well over the decades since I've been away. And I try to go back periodically, although I haven't for a while now. But it is, sometimes you don't have time to reflect on how much things have changed.
So you've been in the, so you came to the U.S. How long have you been in the U.S. then?
Now 4 decades, so a long time.
4 decades, yeah.
Yes. Yes, and Jennifer and I share the history of, we both got scholarships to attend Harvard College. That's something that we share in common, Jennifer Hernandez and I. She was class of 81. I was class of 86. Uh-huh. So, we were
And
not very far apart.
she called it the golden ticket. But
Yes, I would say
I
the
don't want to
same.
dwell on that. But I
Yeah.
just thought it was, look, I look at my own life and think, wow, how lucky I've been and how fortunate in so many different ways.
Yeah.
But I didn't go to a different country. I didn't migrate. But is that part of where your motivation comes from on these issues, that you come at this from? And I think Jennifer Hernandez does as well, but comes that your own life experience inform how you view these
Yeah.
issues. Is that how would you
Yeah.
describe that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. The India I grew up in was extremely poor. I mean, there was poverty everywhere. You could not escape it. There was just an enormous amount of chronic malnutrition. There were in the city of Bangalore, there were thousands of street kids. That lived in really abject poverty.
Did you have
I don't
electricity
think
in your home when you were growing up?
we had electricity in my home. I was from a middle class home. We had electricity in the home, but we frequently had power outages.
Sure.
We never went. Probably we did not go a week, certainly not a month, without significant outages. We also had chronic water shortages. That was just a part of daily life, that water would be available only for a few hours a day. And I grew up without telephone service. That was just something that most households did not have back then. I think my perspective is very much informed by the reality that I saw growing up, and also the reality that I see in my field work in sub-Saharan Africa. I've spent a couple of decades conducting field work in Africa, conducting surveys of businesses, trying to understand the constraints that people face on a daily basis. I think that becomes kind of part of you. It becomes ingrained in the way you think. What experiences you have, the things you see on the sides of roads, the things that you see in people's homes, the kinds of daily shortages they have to cope with, whether it be food shortages or power shortages. In sub-Saharan Africa, the hum of generators is ever present in big cities. And in smaller towns, there are many households, millions of households, where you cannot switch on a light bulb. I think these kinds of things you don't forget. And I think this is what's very hard to explain to rich country constituencies, that what it's like to not have electricity for several hours a day. Jennifer was saying that the analogy I should use is try to get people to think about not being able to use your phone for several hours a day. She said people are just so dependent on their phones.
Right.
Take away their phones for 4 or 5 hours and see what that feels like. I think that's the experience that's lacking in these conversations about how Africans should not be using fossil fuels, or that the degrowth conversation, for example, that we're growing too much, we consume too much, we should consume much less. I think these are informed by kind of the rich world luxuries that we take for granted.
That's a key point. I think that, and I've written that some of that is something that rhymes with some of the thoughts I've had and some of the writing that I've done. Just that there. If you're rich and you never experience shortage, then there's just this kind of assumption, well, we can just use less. Well, I don't waste energy, right? That's my joke. I don't waste any energy. I'm sure everyone else wastes energy, and lots of it, but I use the right amount. I don't ever waste it. But let's shift gears, because I was also attracted to a piece that you wrote in 2015 about Haiti, and then I want to talk about Africa. But I wrote a piece that I published in Forbes just a few days ago about the fact that, I think it was December 12th, there were 95 people in Haiti who were burned alive while trying to collect just a little fuel that had been from an overturned fuel tanker in Cap Haitien. And that in the United States, the idea that we would go and try and collect gasoline from a wrecked fuel tanker. In fact, last year alone, over 260 human beings around the world died, burned alive. In Sierra Leone, in Lebanon, in Kenya, it was in Kenya, and then in Haiti. So this idea of extreme energy poverty is unknown in the United States, and yet. So back to your piece. I didn't call to tell you, or tell you for me to talk.
It's a very good point, Robert. And I think I saw your piece. I think the example you used of people trying to collect gas, that's not something Americans have seen, that most Americans have seen.
They would never think of doing that. Are you out of your mind? The police would be on the scene in a moment saying, get the hell away from here.
Exactly. And we as individuals would be thinking about our own safety. And the fact that people are willing to risk their lives to collect some fuel for their families should really demonstrate the extent to which energy is so short and poverty is so great in these countries. I'm glad you used that as an example because it is such a stark contrast to what an American would do if they saw a fuel tanker overturning.
Yeah. And it's all, and the word that I keep coming back to is this idea, oh, well, everyone should use less, that, with these people, how quaint that you say this is how quaint that you're so comfortable that you think everyone else should use it. But anyway, okay, so back to your piece in 2015, the headline was Haiti, where has all the money gone? Well, where has all the money gone? You're talking about all the development money that has gone into Haiti. Where did it go?
I think Haiti is an example where our development dollars have really just not been spent wisely at all, and we have little to show for it. I think it's a great tragedy all around. I looked at what happened to the money that was sent to Haiti after the 2010 quake. Mm-hmm. That was the subject of the paper. Haiti's GDP at the time was about $9 billion, and the amount of money that was allocated after the quake was about $9 billion, about the same as Haiti's GDP. 3 billion of it was, I think, US funds. 3 billion was private money. And there was another 3 billion from other sources. And I was trying to track what happened. Here's a country that got the equivalent of its GDP in aid after the quake. And what I found was that basically there was a sort of a network of international NGOs that absorbed the money. And Haiti is sometimes called the Republic of NGOs because it is just so filled with international players setting up shop in Haiti. And they were the first recipients of this money. And they then had subcontractors who then had another set of subcontractors, sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 sets of subcontractors. And I lost track of the money. I simply couldn't figure out what happened after the first or maybe second level. So a large NGO would get, say, 30 million or 50 million or $100 million. And then they would subcontract to somebody to do the work, who would then maybe subcontract to someone else. But as that money got diluted, each player would take some overhead. I could not tell how much money actually got spent on projects. And my sense was that, very little of this was actually reaching the Haitian people. It was sort of getting disbursed in overhead, in cars and drivers and rental homes and, not
enough people building houses or water plants, or they're actually doing work.
And certainly not enough locals doing work. It was getting disbursed among sort of this international bureaucracy that had landed in the country. So I was trying to make a plea in that paper to move to local financing and to move to better tracking. USAID at the time was not able to track what was happening to all this money that they were sending. They could track to first level. They couldn't track after that. I think they've improved their tracking systems. And the current head of USAID, Samantha Power, is very keen to do more local procurement. And she has made some statements about engaging locals more. If they can pull that off, that would be a huge improvement over what happened and what has been happening in Haiti for decades. But as long as they rely on this international bureaucracy, I think very little change will occur.
Well, I want to follow that up because one of the things, and I'll ask the question directly. You've also written about Nigeria. In 2020, you wrote a piece about Nigeria and its electric grid, and you wrote this. You said, Nigeria's blossoming tech sector could provide quality jobs for the country's burgeoning youth population. However, like most industries in Nigeria, it is hamstrung by consistently poor power supply. This will be a first-order problem to solve if Nigeria is to reach its ambitions in this space. Well, just a quick personal note. Decades ago, I saw a piece on 60 Minutes about Nigeria's power problems. And I saw another piece in 2016, which led to me writing my latest book, A Question of Power. That was the motive. That was the motivation. I thought, well, what is going on in Nigeria? So here's the question. How closely related is the issue of corruption and poor power systems? But are bad electric grids caused by poor corruption, or poor corruption mean bad power grids? How is that? How do you connect those issues?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and not one that I've done a lot of work on. I will say in the Nigeria context, cost recovery is a big problem in Nigeria. So the distribution companies do not operate profitably, and so
Because so many people steal electricity.
yes, there's theft of electricity. That is a significant problem. There's also issues with sort of not being able to price electricity appropriately, and not being able to supply it kind of cheaply enough. There can be, I think, some investments made in infrastructure that would enable electricity to be produced more efficiently. And there needs to be a lot of investment on the distribution side, including reduction of theft, including tariff setting, better advice and better guidance on tariff setting, and then improving the capacity of distribution companies to operate efficiently and to be able to bill properly. I mean, it's a very complex story. Corruption is a part of it, but I do think that the cost recovery angle is what external agencies should be helping Nigeria to figure out. I think these problems are solvable. They have been going on for a long time. That is frustrating. You mentioned that you've been working on this for a long time, and Nigeria has had a power problem for a very long time. But I do think these problems can be unpacked and can be addressed one by one. But we do need the external players involved in Nigeria, amongst other things, to be focused on improving the energy infrastructure of Nigeria. Also, we need the state governments in Nigeria to think about distribution carefully and to try to figure out the various problems that plague the distribution companies, the discoms, in the Nigerian setting. There's a whole bunch of things: tapping of lines, not setting pricing properly, not being able to bill companies properly. I remember one time when I was surveying some Nigerian companies, everybody was paying a different rate. So these sorts of things need to be sorted out. But it is something that I think external players can help with, including the U.S. government.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I guess I've had a different view, which is that for these countries, that they're going to have to solve some of these issues themselves, right? That there's not that foreign countries are not going to be able to solve the corruption problems or go in there and say, no, you have to do it this way. That there's going to have to be some reform within these countries themselves. I mean, it was a similar situation we saw in Lebanon. Does that make sense?
No, agreed. Yeah, no, that you're right. You're right. I didn't mean that. I think what I was thinking was that, if there is an infrastructure program in Nigeria, by these external players, which there is, almost everybody has something going on. It would be nice if they could focus on sort of helping the locals unpack these distribution company problems. Yeah. But I do agree with you that these are problems that have to be solved locally. I think there are efforts underway across sub-Saharan Africa to address the profitability. Many of these distribution companies are not profitable across the African continent, and there are efforts being made by governments to address these concerns. But these are the concerns that need to be addressed, not banning fossil fuels. We need to be kind of getting the energy infrastructure to become more solid, more robust, and be up and functioning. That's really where I would like to see everybody focus their attention.
So, I asked that, but if you're not, so my direct question would be, so how big of a problem is corruption? I mean, in general, you've been working in Africa yourself, for now a long time. How big of a problem is corruption in getting more power to the people?
So, I think that one view is that it's sort of an overwhelming problem, and that it's sort of cross-cutting, and it kind of it sort of pervades everything, and it makes problems very difficult to solve. But my own view is that from going back and forth to Africa now for 3 decades, we have seen tremendous improvements across the board. In every aspect of life. Africa is very different now than it was when I first started to do field work. Many countries have seen significant progress. My view about corruption is that yes, you do see a lot of corruption in very poor countries, but you do also gradually see over time improvements in governance and improvements in state capacity. From a personal point of view, I found it very difficult to identify how that happens, but I do think it happens. I do think state capacity improves and as incomes go up and those two reinforce each other. And so we have seen, for example, in across many countries in Africa, including in Nigeria, the emergence of a technocratic class that's very good. So Africa's central bankers, for example, now are world class. And in the 2008 financial crisis, they managed it better, I would say, than many central bankers in other places. We are seeing in governments now, and have for a while now, this technocratic class that has become established, that is trying to solve problems, that is trying to make countries more democratic. I mean, we do have setbacks. We have currently in Ethiopia and Sudan and so on, a lot of unrest, a lot of conflict. There are setbacks. And there are some states that are stubbornly poor where we haven't seen much progress. But in a lot of countries, we have seen improvement in state capacity. So I don't see corruption as a fixed thing. I don't see it as something that just will never change and will always be the overwhelming problem that Africans face. I think that state capacity does improve, corruption does become less, as a rising middle class or an emerging middle class wants more from its government. I think developments in e-government, for example, there's more information available on websites. You can go to African government websites now and download all kinds of data about service delivery, about tax revenues, all sorts of things. So I think there are improvements. I think we should be
this is positive about those. This is good to hear, because I think that you're much more familiar, obviously, than I am. But yeah, I think that these reforms, then what I hear you saying is these reformers are happening. They're coming internally from their own governments.
Yes.
That this is
Yes.
this is a process of development that's just going to take time. Well, so then let me ask then, so you've been in Africa. Which countries are the up and comers then? If you handicap Africa, I hear a lot of friends of mine, I think Steve Brick, he's been to Ghana. Priscilla, she was at the dialogue. She's in Juice. I've forgotten her. Angapong, I think, is her last name. She's in my documentary. I can't remember her last name, but she's from Ghana. But Ghana is often mentioned as a country in Africa that is on the rise. What other countries is that true? And what other countries would you say are really leading the pack in terms of development and reform and emerging as viable and sustainable growth economies?
Yeah, it is interesting to think about who the emerging leaders are and what some of the trade-offs are as they have expanded their economies. So Ghana is a very interesting case, I think, because it has grown its economy and it has strengthened its democracy. So Ghana has had several peaceful transitions of power now,
right.
And democracy has become very embedded in the in the country, in the civic discourse, and as well as it has enjoyed some economic growth. And Accra has become a very sort of bustling city. It's kind of the hub of a lot of activity, and so I think that is a good candidate. Similarly, I would say Kenya has had quite a lot of progress, but there are other countries where there's progress on some dimensions, but perhaps not on others, and that are sort of complex cases. And I think Ethiopia is a good case of that. So Ethiopia has invested in its food sector very significantly over a number of decades, investing in agriculture, investing in urban food subsidies to keep food cheap in cities, and has enjoyed some degree of industrialization as a result. So factories have emerged. Foreign investors have come in to assemble garments, for example, or do light manufacturing. China has put a lot of money into infrastructure in Ethiopia. But at the same time, Ethiopia is plagued by ethnic conflict. And there is a bloody and awful war going on right now, between different factions, including the government, which has, become quite the aggressor in terms of trying to suppress various groups that are opposed to it. So Ethiopia is both, right? It's on the one hand, it's had all this economic growth. On the other hand, everybody's terrified about what's happening right now, and everyone's trying to end this conflict that has caused a lot of deaths and a lot of suffering. So there's that example. The other one that I think is a complex story is Rwanda. Rwanda looks like a developed country. It looks beautiful. The capital city is extremely clean. It's extremely well organized. The Rwanda government is really well functioning. It has turned around from the dreadful genocide in the mid 90s into becoming this kind of model country in some sense, with all sorts of investments in development. It's a developmental state. Its president talks about economic development every day. At the same time, it is not a democratic place, and people in the opposition have found themselves in jail or have had worse outcomes. And so that's an interesting, complex story of a state that has invested very heavily in economic development and has seen real gains in incomes and in livelihoods, but has not, is troubling from a political perspective, has not seen improvements, I think, in its democratic outcomes. South Africa remains a challenge. I think, South Africa, despite its really terrible past, has come together and has tried to kind of come out of centuries of apartheid type rule, but we do see South Africa struggling to grow. Unemployment, particularly with its Black population, is really high. At the same time, there have been some developments. There's been some progress. I think it's kind of trying to move forward in some positive ways. So I think it's a complex story, but I would say overall that East and Southern Africa, I think, has seen substantial progress. The West African states, many are moving to middle income status or are in middle income status. So Senegal, for example, other states in West Africa are doing quite well. It's the middle part where we're struggling. So Congo's still really poor. Sierra Leone poor, but growing from a very poor base, also dealing, coming out of post-conflict, but I think dealing quite well with its challenges. There's a
maybe it's not a fair question. I mean, with their 70 some odd countries in the continent, so it's a big place. But so let me shift gears there for a moment, because we talked about Africa, we talked about development. And I hear this dialogue or these claims over and over that we're going to find some new technologies, but we've talked about gas and renewables, but is that where the money should be spent? I mean, Todd has done great work on saying how much more investment in gas will do for the broad population than investment in renewables. Is that where, in terms of on the energy and power front, I just want to maybe repeat what we talked about before. Is that where investment should be made now in Africa and other countries, is in gas infrastructure? Is that where the money is best spent now, do you think?
I think the money is very well spent in building out its gas infrastructure. Africa sits on a huge amount of gas, 600 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves, of which a third is in Nigeria. So 200 of the 600 is in Nigeria. And Africa can really use those natural gas reserves. They can use it for export. They can use it for domestic production. They can use it for downstream uses, various types of uses. We talked about fertilizer. We talked about cement and steel production, about roads, about fuels. I think they could enjoy a very significant increase in the rate of growth if there was a concerted effort to build out that infrastructure. At the same time, many African countries are developing geothermal, they're developing hydro, they're developing wind, they're developing solar. The middle part of Africa, a huge amount of solar, the north coast of Africa, a lot of wind energy. So a number of countries are developing renewables. That's also very promising. And I think there are 5 or 6 countries now that are majority renewable in terms of their energy use. And that's also very promising. I think we need to take a reasonable approach. These are very poor countries that need to solve poverty. That is their first goal: poverty alleviation, lifting millions of people out of poverty, out of earning below $2 a day and barely surviving. We need to lift all of those people out of poverty. To do that, Africa's energy infrastructure needs to vastly increase. It's not a question of minor developments on the side. We really need massive investments across a range of energy sources. And natural gas is critical to that. We can think about it as a bridge fuel. We can think about it as a transition fuel, but we will need natural gas sources probably for several decades before more cleaner things come along. And by all means, if cleaner things come along, by all means, we should help people to use those and finance them or whatever. But until such time, we cannot ask Africans to not develop and to remain poor. because
Well, and
we
I
don't
think,
like the production of natural gas. That's not okay.
well, I think that's the key point, right? Isn't it that poverty alleviation and something I've seen with my own eyes, right? That people may be concerned in developing world, they may be concerned about climate change, but their first concern is getting the
Yes,
lights on.
exactly.
That they're,
Yes.
that climate change. I mean, I remember asking in Puerto Rico, Iris Ortiz about, well, yeah, she said, yeah, I believe in climate change, but we have to run our generator. I got to get my kids; they have to do their homework. We need lights. We got the refrigerator has to run, otherwise the food goes bad. So I think that this priority, I think you've got it. It rhymes exactly, and I think you're hitting the issue exactly right in this idea about poverty alleviation has to be the first priority. And one of the key ways you do that is make sure that they have electricity.
Yes, it is central. Energy and electricity is central, whether it be electricity in homes, electricity in hospitals and schools. The other thing that I think energy is very central for is building more resilient infrastructure.
Mm,
Africa is being buffeted by more weather events due to climate change that we have caused in rich countries. And to cope with that, we need better roads, better buildings, buildings that don't collapse in typhoons or hurricanes. Those are the kinds of things that need more energy. And
sure.
I think we need to think about this from a logical perspective rather than trying to just impose blanket bans to, make ourselves look better.
So just a quick station break. So I'm interviewing Vijaya Ramachandran. She is the director for energy and development at the Breakthrough Institute. Vijaya, we've been talking almost an hour here, so I don't want to take too much more of your time. But whose work in this field do you admire? I know you've worked with Todd Moss. He's been on the podcast. But when you think about these broader issues around energy development and really a humanist approach, because I think that that's ultimately, if I was going to argue for how I see your work, you're an energy humanist, right? No, we're going to think about people first, right? And I think
Yes.
that's exactly right. Whose work in this field do you admire that you follow?
You mentioned Arvind Subramaniam. He's been writing about this for a long time. I think that that's somebody for people to follow, and he just has so much experience in India. Uzodinma Iviala, who runs the Africa Policy Center, is also someone I think worth following in this space. Zainab Usman at the Carnegie Center. She leads the Africa program at Carnegie, has written extensively on energy in Africa, has published a book on energy use in African countries, and has thought deeply about these issues, including the various challenges around resource extraction. So that's somebody worth following. Todd Moss, as you mentioned, his colleague Katie Auth, who also at the Energy for Growth Hub, worked a lot on U.S. energy issues. In the U.S. government, Andy Herskowitz, really a very deep thinker and careful thinker on energy issues, I think also worth following. There are a number of people trying to make this conversation more logical. My boss, Ted Nordhaus at the Breakthrough Institute, has been writing about eco-modernism, as you know, for decades, and trying to remind people that it is really about people, and it's about balancing priorities, not just becoming focused on one particular thing, but really trying to understand how to better people's lives. So I think there is a core group of people. You yourself have written and spoken about this topic. So I think we all need to just kind of keep pushing forward. The momentum now very much is that there is a sense of urgency around the problem of climate change. I understand that. I'm sympathetic to that. But I think we cannot forget that there are millions of poor people for whom energy is very, very critical. And that's something we cannot lose sight of.
So what are you reading? What this is the other question I ask nearly all of my guests. What's on your nightstand, or what's on the top of your bookshelves that you're reading now at hand?
Well, I recommend for everybody Bill Gates's book on climate change.
Okay.
And the title, of course, I'm not good about remembering titles, but I think that's a good place to start, for people trying to understand the complexities of these issues, trying to reduce carbon emissions while also trying to alleviate poverty, while also trying to make countries more adaptable and more resilient. It's a really complex mix of things. And I think we need to understand them in a kind of multidimensional sense. And I really feel like Bill Gates's book accomplished that. In very clear prose, he tries to make it very clear what the challenges are, for rich countries, for the development of technology, but then also for poor countries that are trying to adapt and also trying to grow and grow out of poverty and so on. So that's something I recommend.
Well, so you mentioned Gates, and it made me realize we haven't yet mentioned the word nuclear. And there are some, there are people saying, oh, well, this would be perfect for Africa. And there's been a lot of reports that have been written on and so on. I'm skeptical for several reasons. One is just because I know that from my own experience in looking at the nuclear industry, you need a very strong government. You need strong civil society for you to have a strong nuclear sector. But you haven't mentioned nuclear at all in Africa. Do you think it's going to play any role there in the next decade or two? If so, where?
I think it's down the road. I don't see an immediate investment in nuclear. There is some interest, and Cape Town has a nuclear power plant. So there are a couple of nuclear facilities, I think, across the continent. But I don't see policymakers demanding that much yet from nuclear. I think the attention is much more on natural gas right now. And
India is pushing forward very aggressively on nuclear.
Yes,
and as of course is China.
Yes, absolutely. India, I think, has the state capacity, as does China, and it has the money, to finance the stuff. That's the other thing. I think for Africa, that's an issue. I think we will see India push into nuclear more in the coming decade, and certainly the next several decades. There are a handful of nuclear power plants currently in India, but I think there is an interest to push forward on nuclear, particularly on the next generation. The more modern nuclear power plants.
But in the near term, India is going to continue being a big coal user. I mean, that's been very clear in the wake of COVID that they're going to use a lot of coal, and because there's, of course, the Indian Railroad is heavily dependent on the coal trade. I mean, this is very much embedded in the Indian society as the key to their power grid. Is the way I've seen it. Do you see it the same way?
Absolutely, Robert. And I think it's important to understand coal in India from that perspective, that it's very embedded into the economy and into various sectors. So Coal India alone employs 4 million people. And across the coal sector, millions more are employed. There are 700 plus districts in India that are dependent on coal revenues to finance public service delivery. There are cash transfers given to poor people that are based on coal revenues. There are several states that have a sort of income transfer mechanism, the way Alaska does, to transfer incomes to poor households. There are people who are dependent directly for employment. Coal is a very critical input in India, and it will take some time for India to exit from coal. It does want to at least phase down, if not phase out completely. It does want to reduce its coal use. But I think rather than sort of being hyped up and being, completely focused on wording and COP statements and so on, the, external partners that want to work with India need to really fully understand the complexity of coal. And the fact that this reduction in coal use or coal dependence is going to take time. It's going to be a while, and it's going to have to, India is going to have to figure out how to find replacements for these income transfers, like where is the revenue going to come from? If we are doing public service delivery from coal revenues,
and where are the jobs going? And where are the jobs? I didn't know.
Exactly.
I knew that the Indian Railway had something like a million employees, and it's one of the big. Of course, coal is one of its biggest customers. Coal India is, but I had no idea Coal India employed 4 million people. It's an enormous number.
It's an enormous number. There are a lot of people in India dependent on coal, and there are a handful of states that are extremely coal dependent, where the mines are, they're dependent on those revenues for everything. And so I think any conversation about coal in India has to take that into account. It cannot just be, we don't like coal, you have to shut it down immediately.
Right.
That's a non-starter. It's a non-starter for the Indians, and the Indians have pushed back heavily on that narrative.
Sure. So last question, what gives you hope?
I have hope on several fronts. I think that there are new technologies that are coming on board that will make energy sources cleaner, and that's helpful, whether it be making natural gas cleaner or making, new forms of energy that are coming on board. I think anything that comes on board in rich countries Rich countries should be focused on helping poor countries use new technologies and provide financing for that and adaptation money for new technology. So that's one thing that gives me hope. I think some of that is going on. But I think also poorer countries are finding their voice on this. They are becoming a stronger voice. I think they were a much stronger voice at COP26 than previous COPs. I think India has a significant role to play in that, in bringing all the poor countries together to say, look, our priority is to make people lead better lives. And that's something that we cannot ignore in this push to reduce emissions. So I'm hopeful that various coalitions of so-called developing countries are coming together to be more forceful about that. And, for the first time, for example, we have language about loss and damage included at a COP. So I think these are positive things. Next year's COP, or rather this year's COP, is going to be in Africa. So I'm really hoping that African governments can change the conversation to make it a more positive conversation, where we are looking at goals of poverty alleviation alongside emissions targets. And I think, more broadly, we need to sort of stay hopeful that we can solve both problems. We don't need to solve climate change at the cost of keeping people poor. I don't think we need to do that. I think if we put our minds to it, we can really come up with technological solutions, whether it be advanced nuclear, whether it be cleaner sources of energy, whether it be improving natural gas production, whatever it might be. I think we can sort of address both goals, and we have to address both goals. If we just address climate change and ignore poverty, that is completely immoral. And that's not a path that we should go down. And I don't think that we can allow that to happen. I don't think poor countries will allow that to happen.
Well, I think that's a good summary and a good place to stop. Vijaya Ramachandran, many thanks for being on the Power Hungry podcast. I didn't mention that you can find Vijaya, I meant to mention this, on Twitter at Vij Ramachandran, Vij Ramachandran, at Vij Ramachandran on Twitter. You can also follow her on the Breakthrough Institute website, which is www.thebreakthrough.org. Any last thoughts there, Vijaya? You did summarize very well, I thought, what you just said on what gives you hope.
Thanks so much for having me on this podcast, Robert. I really enjoyed speaking with you. And I hope that, together we and others can influence this conversation so that it sort of goes to a more productive place where, concerns around poverty and around energy poverty and income poverty rise to the forefront and influence the conversation around climate change. I'm really hoping that can happen in 2022 and beyond.
I do as well. Well, listen, thanks again, Vijaya. It's been a great pleasure. And thanks to all of you in podcast land for listening to this episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Tune in next time. If you have a chance, give us a positive rating on those podcast outlets, 5, 10, 20 stars, whatever they allow you. But until then, I'll see you on the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast.